The starting point for talking about the Hellenistic world is with two vocabulary words. The words Hellenic and Hellenistic. It's kind of interesting, the way that languages work sometimes. We've been saying quite a bit over the last couple of weeks about ancient Greek culture, ancient Greek society. We've talked about the Greek language, the Greek gods, and so on. But it's interesting that the Greeks themselves didn't call themselves Greeks. The Romans called the Greeks the Greeks. They called them the Gregos. That's where we get the word Greek from. But the Greeks didn't call themselves Greek. The Greeks called themselves the Hellenos. Hellenos is the Greek word for Greek. And so the word Hellenos is just a fancy way. Now we're back to these words Hellenic and Hellenistic. The word Hellenic is just a fancy way of saying Greek. I say it's a fancy way because it uses a Greek word to refer to Greek people or language or food or whatever. If you're driving down the road and you see a sign for a Hellenic restaurant, that means they serve Greek food. Probably means they serve pretty good food, because Greek food tends to be pretty good food. Well, think about how the English language works now. If the word Hellenic means Greek, what would the word Hellenistic mean? Well, the word Hellenistic means Greek-like the Greek stuff, Greek-ish, maybe, influenced by the Greeks, be another way to put it. The word Hellenistic is going to refer to people who aren't themselves Greek, who don't have a Greek family name, who don't have Greek DNA, who are not biologically Greek, but who've adopted the Greek way of life, who've adopted Greek culture. And by Greek here, essentially, I mean the Athenian way of life. I'm being a little bit broad there, but not too broad, I don't think. Essentially, the Athenian way of life. We're going to see the way of life that develops in Athens spreading far beyond the city limits of Athens, far beyond what we think of as ancient Greece, and coming to affect, a big part of the Earth's population. As a symbol of the Hellenistic world, I'd like you to take as a symbol of the Hellenistic world a sculpture which you have in your textbook on page 19, figure 4.1 on page 19. The Laocoon group is what it's called, and you see that name in the caption there. It's a sculpture which is made in the Greek style. That's just a fancy way of saying that it looks like a Greek sculpture. In other words, it doesn't look like a Chinese sculpture or an Egyptian sculpture. It's made in the Greek style. It tells a Greek story. It tells a story out of the story of the Trojan War. You remember that story? Part of that story is told in Homer's Iliad. I've mentioned that war a couple of times to you, I think. And, it's a very important war in shaping the way the Greeks thought about themselves, and, there's references to it all over Greek culture. Here is a part of the story right at the end of the war. The Trojans wake up one morning, they look out over the city walls, and it looks like the Greek army's gone home, and they left behind this big wooden horse. And the Trojans say, "Hey, free horse, let's bring it inside the city gates." Well, you've heard the story before. I told it to you a couple of days ago in class anyway, and you'd heard it before then anyway. But here's a part of the story you may not have heard because it's rarely retold in the retelling of the story. But the Trojans began to make preparations to bring this big wooden horse into their city. And one guy, a guy named Laocoon, says to himself, "Wait a second, this is weird. Ordinarily, when armies leave, they don't leave behind big wooden horses. Something's not right about this." In fact, he says, you may have heard the phrase before, he says, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." In other words, we've been fighting the Greeks for 14 years or whatever. Why in the world would they all of a sudden leave and then leave behind this big wooden horse? Why would they give us a big wooden horse? Something is wrong about this. Let's think about this. And Laocoon and his two sons begin moving through the crowd. Laocoon is the figure in the center there. The two sons, of course, are on the outside. They begin moving through the crowd, trying to get people to think about what they're doing before they let in this big wooden horse. Well, anyway, one of the gods who is on the side of the other Greek cities sends a big snake to kill Laocoon and his two sons, and that's the scene that you see going on in the sculpture. So it's a sculpture that's made in the Greek style. It tells a Greek story. It tells a story that involves one of the Greek gods, but it's not made for Greek people. It's made for Hellenistic people. It's made for people who aren't themselves Greek, but who've adopted the Greek way of life. It's made for people for whom stories of the Greek gods are stories about their gods. Stories about the war with Troy is a story that somehow affects their culture. They've adopted the Greek way of life, the Greek language, the Greek religion, even though they themselves aren't Greek. And so this set of sculptures makes a good symbol of the Hellenistic world. Well, the first big name we're going to be talking about in this class, at least in terms of the organization of the course, the big name for the Hellenistic world, the first big name for the Hellenistic world, the way I've organized the course, is Alexander the Great. And the first thing to notice about Alexander the Great is that contrary to just about every movie or cartoon or TV show where you've seen Alexander the Great depicted, he's not Greek. Alexander the Great is not Greek. It's a very common misconception. Instead, Alexander comes from a part of the world to the north of Greece, a part of the world called Macedonia. On the map on the screen here, Macedonia is essentially the red area on the map. Macedonia lies to the north of Greece. The Greeks liked having the Macedonians as neighbors. The Macedonians were a civilized people. They lived in cities, they had a written language, and they're a very large nation. The Greeks liked having the Macedonians as neighbors because the Macedonians kept the bad guys away. The bad guys the Greeks called the barbarians. The barbarians are wandering around up here in the northern Balkans, beating up on people, killing people, and all that kind of stuff, robbing people, stealing stuff. The barbarians are wandering around up there, but in order to get down to Greece, see, they've got to go through this large population and this large army. So the Macedonia serves as what today we would call a buffer state between Greece and the barbarians. They keep the barbarians away. The Macedonians like having the Greeks as neighbors because the Greeks have lots of cool stuff. The Greeks have cool sculptures to look at and cool philosophy to think about and cool plays to go watch and cool sculptures to see and all that kind of thing. And, well, eventually one Macedonian is going to like the Greek stuff so much, he's just going to take that large Macedonian army and go take it all for himself. And that's Alexander's father, Philip of Macedon. Macedon, of course, is just another way of saying Macedonian, kind of an old-fashioned way of saying Macedonian. Philip takes the large Macedonian army and launches an invasion of Greece and conquers Greece. When he does, part of what had made ancient Greece kind of a unique place dies out, and that is that every city had its own way of life, its own culture, its own political system, and so on. Well, when Philip moves the Macedonian army in and conquers Greece, then no longer do the Greeks have the ability to decide for themselves how they want to live, and they all have to live the way the Macedonians tell them to. And so that unique part of ancient Greece kind of dies away pretty quickly. Well, like I said, Philip likes the Greek stuff. And when he gets to Athens down here, you see Athens down here. When he gets to Athens, he asks around for a good teacher for his son Alexander. And of course, everybody in Athens says, well, if you want a good teacher, well, then you want Aristotle. Because Aristotle had studied with Plato. Plato had studied with Socrates. And so Philip essentially kidnaps Aristotle, makes him his prisoner, takes him back to Macedonia, where he becomes Alexander's teacher. For a big part of Alexander's life, Aristotle and Alexander spend time every day talking, working through homework problems and math problems and all that kind of thing. The idea of Aristotle and Alexander having this type of friendship and this learning relationship has captured people's imagination. You see two takes on the screen of Aristotle and Alexander in conversation. We don't usually think of Alexander the Great as a philosopher, but he is. He takes an interest in Aristotle's favorite subject matter, biology. As he travels around the world killing people, he will take notes of interesting plants and animals that he sees, and has an interest in biology. Well, Alexander comes to the throne as a young man, and there's an awful lot of story we're skipping over here. In the world history course, we'd spend probably an hour just talking about Alexander's life, an interesting character. Actually, he comes to power when his mother has his father assassinated so that he becomes king of Macedonia a little bit earlier than nature had intended. Alexander comes to the throne as a young man of about 21 years of age. At that time, he controls Macedonia, which is the dark blue area on the map. His father has conquered Greece, which is the light blue areas, and the Greek colonies, which are the green areas on the map. Well, Alexander will consolidate his power back home, and then set off on his lifelong quest, which was to rule the world. Alexander, well, he has a bit of an ego problem. Part of your clue there is that his name is Alexander the Great. I mean, you try that with your friends and see how long that lasts, okay? But Alexander pulls it off. He's one of these the great guys. And part of his desire to rule the world comes from that ego problem. It comes from the power he would have, the wealth he would have that would go along with that power. But a big part of his interest in conquering the world comes from his interest in philosophy. One of the chief textbooks that Aristotle and Alexander worked through several times. Like I said, during Alexander's adolescence, he's spending a good part of just about every day in conversation with Aristotle about various things, and they worked through Plato's Republic. That was the #1 textbook for Alexander to use. And we've talked about Plato's Republic. You might remember that at the end of Plato's Republic, Plato begins discussing what the best form of government would be. And for Plato, the best form of government would certainly not be democracy. Plato despises democracy. He says only a fool would live in a democracy. It's easy to understand why. I mean, democracy had killed Plato's friend, Socrates, had killed his teacher. He says only a fool would live in a place where the majority of the people could just kill you. He despises democracy. For Plato, the best form of government would be a dictatorship, and Plato is very clear about this, a dictator, one person who has complete control over society. A kind of person a dictator that Plato calls the philosopher king. That's 2 words with a hyphen between them, philosopher hyphen king. A dictator who would have complete control of society, but who would be a benevolent dictator. A good guy dictator. A nice dictator. Think about Saddam Hussein driving around Baghdad in an ice cream truck handing out ice cream to little kids. A benevolent dictator. A nice guy dictator. A dictator who would rule wisely and with wisdom and reason and logic and would make decisions that were good for the city. For Plato, that would be the best form of government, a dictatorship where you had a good dictator who was wise and benevolent and all that kind of stuff. Well, Alexander wants to know, would it be possible to rule the whole world based on Plato's philosophy, with, of course, himself as the philosopher king? So Alexander consolidates his power back home and then begins to move. He consolidates his power back home in Macedonia and Greece. He begins marching across where Turkey is today, down through where Syria is today, where Lebanon is today, where Israel is today. He conquers Egypt, marching along the Nile River, collecting surrenders from cities. Egypt falls very quickly to Alexander. You might remember at the start of the course I mentioned to you that Egypt really didn't have a very large army. Certainly not compared to other places in the ancient world because, it's surrounded by desert. If you've only been invaded once in 3,000 years, self-defense is not high on your priorities. And, the Egyptian army falls, and Egypt in general falls very quickly to Alexander. Alexander continues moving to the west. He conquers where Libya is today. And then he backtracks across where Iraq is today, across where Iran is today. I've got some photos of a mosaic here showing Alexander defeating the Persian Empire. Alexander, of course, is over here. And the detail from that mosaic, and I think even closer detail. Well, he's conquered across where Iran is today, down through where Pakistan is today. He'll conquer where Afghanistan is today. That's only happened twice in world history. Alexander does it the first time. Until he comes to the border of India. He gets to the Indus River, which you see here. He looks across the Indus River at a massive civilization. Ancient India is a very interesting place. We certainly could have talked about it when we talked about ancient riverine civilizations. There would be an awful lot of interesting things to say about it. But a very large population. And on the other side of India is China. Another very large civilization, another very advanced civilization. And Alexander, well, he has an ego problem, okay, but he's also a pretty smart guy. And Alexander realizes that even as great as he is, you see, that he can't control the entire world. That one person can't control the entire world. No way he can rule all those people. And so he turns back around, brings himself back to Babylon down here. Whoops. Went too far. There we go. There. He comes back to Babylon, the new capital which he rebuilds, right in the center of his new empire, where he dies. As a very young man, only in his early 30s, Alexander was an outdoorsman, a sportsman. He liked hunting and camping and that kind of thing. He goes hunting one day. He drinks water from a stream. You're not supposed to do that. That's a big no-no. He drinks water from a stream where apparently a dead animal had fallen into the stream upstream. He contracts a terrible bacterial infection that just rips through his body. Within just a few hours, he begins constant vomiting and diarrhea, dehydrates, and dies. By the way, that's why you don't just drink whatever water you come across when you're out in the woods. All it takes is a dead animal upstream and you've got really, really serious problems. I told you we talk about just about everything in this course. I mean, Plato's philosophy, how to survive in the woods. I mean, we talk about just about everything. Anyway, Alexander knows the rule, but he breaks the rule. He pays for it with his life. But in only 11 years or so, he's accomplished a great deal. If the standard of greatness of a military leader is and I'm not saying it is, but if it is, if the standard of greatness of a military leader is the amount of population and territory that he conquers, then Alexander's the greatest military leader of all time. He's accomplished a great deal. You see some coins from Alexander's empire, this very large empire. I mean, no one else has ever conquered this many people, has ever conquered this amount of territory before or since. It's an incredible accomplishment. Well, in a world history course, we'd be spending maybe an entire week just talking about Alexander's empire, certainly at least an hour just talking about Alexander, an interesting character. But I just want to point out some things that are important for us in this course. Across this huge empire, Alexander wants to destroy the culture of the people that he conquers. That way they'll become loyal to the new Hellenistic culture. And he takes a number of steps to do this, but two in particular I want to draw your attention to. Alexander sees religion as the foundation of a culture. The way Alexander sees things, if he can destroy a people's religion, then the rest of the culture will just collapse and fall apart. So across this huge empire, Alexander orders that everyone has to worship the Greek gods. In fact, at one point, while he's conquering Egypt, like I said, Egypt falls very quickly to Alexander. It's essentially a process of going down the Nile River, just collecting surrenders from city after city. Well, he gets to one city, which has already heard that Alexander's coming, and they've already figured out that when he gets there, they're going to surrender to him. But one morning, they look out over the city borders, and they see this huge army that darkens the horizon. This massive army. I've got a photograph here of a diagram of one of the Macedonian phalanxes. Imagine these things, these units, darkening the horizon, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And like I said, the Pharaoh's army wasn't all that big, and these people see this huge army. And the mayor of the city, the Egyptian city, goes out to surrender to Alexander and says, Alexander, Emperor Alexander, General Alexander, we surrender to you, but we have a question. We've never seen anyone with so much power, and so we want to know, are you one of the gods? And Alexander says, let me think, am I one of the gods? Yeah, as a matter of fact, I am. And he orders himself to be worshipped as one of the gods. He has temples built to himself, songs sung to him, sacrifices made to him. But the big deal here is that Greek religion spreads across this part of the world. Alexander also makes the Greek language the official language of his new empire. That means that across this huge empire, an awful lot of people, no matter what language they might speak at home, they're going to speak, they're also going to learn to speak the Greek language. If you have any kind of business at all, you have to know how to read Greek, because the contracts had to be written in Greek, because the empire's court system only works with Greek language documents. If you're a young man who's drafted into the army, and a lot of young men will be, then you'll certainly learn to speak Greek, because that's the language your drill instructor will use in boot camp when you receive your initial training. And so an awful lot of people across this huge empire are going to learn the Greek language. No matter what language they might speak at home, Farsi or Persian, whatever they speak at home, Egyptian, Hebrew, whatever they speak at home, they also learn the Greek language. And that, as we're going to see, is going to have a play a dramatic role. For example, when we talk about the development and spread of Christianity, we're going to see Christianity moving very quickly across this part of the world, because for the first about 200 years, the Greek language is the official language of the Christian religion, and it's going to move very quickly. This will be a majority Christian part of the world until the rise of the Muslim Empire, much later than what we're talking about today. But the first big name and the first big spread of Hellenistic civilization, Hellenistic culture, is with Alexander the Great into this large empire.